Welcome to Purple Octopus. From House Studios, this is a show for discovering wholeness in a fractured world.
I'm John Buck, Decision Maker.
I'm Karen Gimnig, Relating.
I'm Laureen Golden, Developing Human.
And I'm François Knuchel, Paradigm Shifting.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to be with you today. We are in June of 2020, which places us in the midst of the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and all of the shift that's happening very much in the US and also around the world around both of those topics. And we are delighted to be together with the Purple Octopus team to record our next web chat. So today we have François Knuchel with us as our speaker, our usual team of 4. And François is going to talk to us about learning to unlearn. And then we'll have some response from the others. So François, go ahead.
Thank you, Karen. We spoke amongst ourselves recently about looking at the metrics that we had developed. These are metrics that we'd developed about a year or even maybe even 2 years ago, looking at how can we tell whether we're operating with a multi-mind or many minds in many mind world. We decided to look at those metrics again, and I've decided to focus on one of the metrics. There are about 9 metrics actually we got together, and I've decided to look at the first one. So the third one. So I'm just going to share the screen. The third one is a stance of humbleness, vulnerability, and inquiry. And that's one I've focused on, but in my mind, it also has a little bit of an element of the first one, which is that of letting go and being vulnerable, dissolving ways that are no longer serving us. But why have I chosen to focus on that particular metric? Well, the reason is actually, it came out of a presentation I gave recently. And one of the things I said quite frequently or I talked about, was about the things that we learned at school are no longer serving us. And therefore, we need to unlearn. We need to start to unlearn many of the things. And we have been taught at school to always have an answer, always have a correct answer, and so on. And this is recently read in a blog by Sonia Bliglout. There's a quote here where she talks about that we live in a society that values knowing. In many ways, we're habituated in equating our self-worth to knowing, having the answers, and being right. When we were children, many of us were shamed by teachers for not knowing the answer to a question and scoring low on a test. And now as adults, no matter our status, we still experience that shame, so the shame of unknowing. Whether we are CEO of Fortune 500 companies or not, or presidents of nations, or stay at home with parents, we still have that sense of self, and often framed by that narrative that if you don't have the right answer, you're incompetent, or good leaders would know what to do. And that is really forming a lot of how we react to things. And in the context of complexity, and my talk was about complexity, that's totally counterproductive. And because we really need to be approaching from a perspective of unknowing, of not knowing. And this directly correlates to the metric of humbleness and vulnerability. But the reason I brought it up in this context is because at the end of my presentation, somebody asked me, one of the questions was, do I have a program for unlearning? And I was a bit stumped by the question, because I'd never thought of it in those terms. I'd never thought of it as a program for unlearning. And the response I gave, that of creating what the Japanese word for ma means empty space, so emptying oneself and starting from a position of unknowing. But I started thinking a lot about it afterwards. How does one empty one's mind? And it's about emptying and emptying the inner dialogue that goes on within us. So we have this inner dialogue that goes on. So one of the things that I picked up from Peter Singer, I think it was, he spent quite a lot of time in China before he was at MIT, and he talked about how he came across this distinction between East and West, that in the West we tend to intellectualize things all the time, whereas in the East people tend to just let things go and ride on quietness. And I realized that part of the unlearning is connected to that, and just letting go and letting emptiness into ourselves, ridding ourselves of this inner dialogue that we constantly have. And it's something I've learned to do, and that's what made me reflect, because the question was, what's the program for Unlearn? So what's the program that I actually applied? What is the program that I learned to do that? And I can't, and even now thinking about it, I can't figure out what the program is, if there is a program. But I can tell you how I learned it. And largely I learned it was from my experience when I went to Japan. And when I went to Japan, initially I couldn't speak the language, and Japan is such a different culture. And the people who lived there, who were there beyond being a tourist, everybody who was there, who'd been there for up to 2 years, so we'd get together in the pubs or in restaurants, and we'd talk about our experience of Japan. And we spent enormous amount of time in intellectualizing, trying to understand the culture, because this culture did not make any sense to us. And every day we'd come up with a new theory. Oh, it must be they think this or this, and it was a constant for 2-year-long sort of dialogue that went on of trying to understand Japanese culture. And at some point, many years later, I bumped into one of those people I'd had sort of these dialogues with, and we sort of looked at each other and we sort of remembered those dialogues we had, and yet they seemed to be so meaningless to both of us. In the meantime, both of us had independently gone different ways, had learned the language, and this whole intellectualizing thing became so irrelevant and unnecessary, and it was as if we'd learned to be rather than to think. But I still don't know. I've come to the conclusion that experience was profound in that it changed me completely inside out. But I can't say I know what the program was, other than having done something completely different. And this is reflected also in the beginner's mind, what's called a shoshin in Japanese, which is all about unlearning or forgetting, and starting from an empty mind and a beginner's mind. The part of the unlearn is, I really now question whether the unlearn is the right word, because, okay, there are situations where we may have to unlearn and undo certain habits, like smoking. So we may have to change the habits and undo the habits that we're used to, so going for the cigarette and so on. But there are many other things we're not really unlearning. We're just temporarily suspending our perspective. So to make that clear, if you think, when I learned to drive a manual car, and so when I later had an automatic, there's a slight relearning, because you've got to learn how to not to press on the clutch, the non-existent clutch, when you're driving an automatic. Now that's a very easy thing to learn. So but it's not really an unlearning, because it's not that I've then suddenly not able to drive an automatic, a manual. It's just a slightly different way of operating. Likewise, when you're learning another language, you're not really unlearning the first language in order to be able to learn the second. That's not the case. Although, and studies have shown that one of the reasons people have difficulty learning languages is because they have a fear of losing their identity. And there is an element of truth in that, because you do temporarily have to suspend your initial your identity in order to learn another language, at least to learn it to the degree where you can start thinking in that language. So learning another language is not about learning a code. A language is really a different way of looking at the world. It's a different perspective, and so when you've got two languages or several languages, you've got different perspectives on the world. Now, it's very difficult to have all those perspectives, to use those perspectives at the same time. You can either see one or the other. It's only when you're talking to somebody who happens to speak exactly the same both languages that you can actually have some kind of combination. But normally you're either in an English mode, or I'm in a French mode, or I'm in a Japanese mode, and the thinking is different. It's very difficult to see at the same time. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this picture of the old woman and the young woman, the larger woman, or the young looking our way, and the other woman looking the other way. And anybody, it's very difficult to see both, and you can't see both at the same time. You can only see one or the other. It's very difficult to see both at the same time. And it's very similar with languages. You can't be in both modes at the same time, but they are different perspectives. But this is not an unlearning. So when you're learning a new language, you're not unlearning the other one. So I think it would be, I'm slightly modifying my view that we should not really be talking about unlearn. We should be really talking about, I haven't given it a term for it yet, but there is a temporary suspension of perspective. So when you're looking at one perspective, you have to take a distance from the other perspective, suspend your perspective. And I think that's one of the things that happens in Imago, for example, when you're mirroring, because it's asking you to suspend your own perspective and through the language used, put yourself in the other perspective and see things from the other perspective, and the language enables you to do that. But you can only do that if you actually use the language of the other person. So one of the things is about emptying one's mind. And there's a famous koan, and koan are these little riddles that is used in Zen to sort of help people empty their minds. This is a story of a Japanese, oh no, it's not a Japanese, well, it was in this story, but the original one is a Chinese and is much older than described here in the quote. But it's a professor who was a master of almost everything, and the only thing he wasn't a master was of Zen Buddhism, or Buddhism. So he decided to go visit a Zen master to learn that. And so while he was explaining what he wanted to do, the Zen Buddhist served tea, and he kept on explaining. And while the professor was explaining, the Buddhist kept pouring on tea, and the tea kept pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring, and it was overflowing. He kept on pouring. And at some point, the professor could no longer contain himself, and he shouted, "It's overfull, no more would go in." And the Zen Buddhist said, "Well, like this cup, you're full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you Zen emptiness unless you first empty your cup?" So in many respects, I think the unlearning is about temporarily emptying your cup in order to let something different come in. This is also reflected in this. The art of Shoshin is really the art of working from a beginner's mind. So there's a quote here: "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are few." Again, this opening up and emptying oneself to let the many possibilities seep in. And I think this is so important in our current times, because it's what we need is to enable that the coming in. I'll just finish with this quote here. So, as leaders, we may all wish to consider how much time and attention we're giving to the things we cannot control relative to the things we can. Accepting that control in a complex system is an illusion allows us to shift our notion of leadership responsibility away from having the answers towards one of enabling the system to find its own answers. And I think that's the crux of the thing. It's about enabling a system or learners to find their own answers. And in education, likewise, it's about enabling learners to find their own learning. It's not about teaching them. And it's all about this letting go, the humility and emptiness, and silence. And silence is really important. At this point, I will go silent. Thank you.
Thank you, François. So let's do a response round. We'll start with John. And everyone, if you want to unmute on your turn.
Thank you, François. I love the co-ed about the cup overflowing. I think that there can be a physical definition of the emptiness. When a new idea comes to you, we now know that there is something chemical that happens. There's a chemical that runs around, and it's got a very unstable end, and your mind somehow, based on what you need to know, changes the end of that chemical. That chemical is called alpha-neurexin. And when it finds a particular place on the side of a neuron, it fastens. As soon as it fastens, it signals to beta-neurexin to come in and build a synapse. And at that point, you can have a conscious thought. If you're building a new habit, they've done studies of mouse brains, and the mouse learns something new, and suddenly there's these, you can see the little synapses forming, little dendrites. And then as they watch that neuron over the next couple of days, as the mouse repeats the behavior, those change, and there's a new set of connections. And so literally, your thinking arises from nothing. There used to be no synapses there, and you couldn't have that thought or that skill. And literally, that thought or that skill goes away as other formations come in. So the process of extinguishing is something your brain is very good at. And the unlearning is literally a process in your brain. So then the question becomes, how do you unlearn something? How do you get your brain to extinguish things that you don't need anymore and bring in new things to fill the cup? And one of those things is sleep. So perhaps one thing for unlearning is sleeping. Being quiet and meditating, I think, also does it. Doing something new brings back the old, or lets go of the old. So that's what I was thinking of as you were talking. And I also was curious, thinking about the fact that I will never unlearn how to ride a bike. I will always know how to ride a bike. So there's parts of your brain that don't let go of learning when it happens. And that's a whole nother phenomenon.
Thanks, John. Laureen?
Thank you. François, really rich, so much to think about, and so much comes up. I think what I would want to add here is thinking about complexity and sociocracy and the law of requisite variety. that like as there's more and more complexity externally, the need to grow more complex internally. And so I really like what you're pointing towards, that like actually we don't actually want to unlearn too much, but maybe I think what might need to be unlearned is how tightly we hold on to knowledge. And it might go back to your thing that you started off with, like how we really get rewarded for knowing. But to me, it's the tightness and the almost the habituated, like this was an answer that worked and therefore it must work everywhere. It's almost reductionist, like this answer works, so therefore it must work everywhere. Everything must be a nail because this is a hammer. And I think what I'm taking away from this conversation is just don't let go of too much, because there's times and places, but the habit of thinking one answer for everything. I think that's one thing. And then just the other thing that I came up for me was the conscious, like unconscious incompetence, and then conscious incompetence, and then conscious competence, and then eventually unconscious competence. But what I think, so where do you start with like what to develop next? More variety around. And my guess is like the pain, that pain is information, and like what is not working right now clearly. And then, you know, bringing some habits into our consciousness to be worked on. But it's the whoosh and the habituated, the routedness of a lot of our first responses. I think that is important. But my takeaway is don't necessarily let go and unlearn. It's more variety in our learning and responses.
Thanks, Laureen. I'm thinking along the same lines you are, I think. I think, François, where you started with, we are so habituated to know, and our value and our identity and our worthiness is so tied to knowing. And it's not just, it's not tied to wisdom particularly so much as like having that one right answer. You know, how many times in school were there 5 right answers? Generally not, right? Like it's the one answer that person of authority thought was the answer. So we're very tied to that. And what I'm thinking about with that is how, because that was the thing that was rewarded, that was safe, that was valued in our formative years, that's where we go back to when we get anxious, when we're uncomfortable, when, and you know, and complexity makes us anxious, right? Like we're talking about states where there's a problem and we're trying to figure out how to solve it. And there's a certain, I mean, not always, sometimes we're very calm about it, but I think often we're trying to solve problems where, you know, our business is on the line, or our job is on the line, or something that we care passionately about, some organization, the survival of something we care about seems to be on the line. And so that brings up anxiety. And to do what you're talking about, to find that solution, requires us, even in the midst of that anxiety, to do something that nothing in our like deeply rooted learnings tells us is okay. And so you mentioned early on the word vulnerability, and I just want to lean into how incredibly vulnerable it feels to let go and to allow space for, and to shift into this other mode that isn't deeply learned in us yet. And so I think the title of that you gave was absolutely apt. It's the learning to unlearn. And there's this sort of place where you kind of just have to take off your life jacket, dive into the deep end of the pool, and survive a couple of times. I think to just notice that, you know, it sounds all very peaceful to be silent and to take time, and I think for most of us, it's not peaceful the first 2 rounds. Like I think most of us sort of do it kicking and screaming. Mostly we lean into vulnerability when it's too painful not to. And the more that we sort of learn that lesson of leaning into what's vulnerable and uncomfortable, paradoxically, perhaps that's the thing that makes it comfortable. So I think that piece of this, of really naming that, it's very easy cognitively to see that makes perfect sense and that's the thing we should do. And, you know, yes, And it's mostly not our cognitive that determines our behavior. And our limbic systems tend to scream when we do these things. So just naming that. And I think naming it and being aware of it, and just even being able to notice, like, I'm really resisting this, I'm really holding on to my one idea, is very much a first step in the letting go that you're talking about. So that's what comes up for me in all of this. And I'm going to give it back to you, François, for the last turn in the round, and we'll close out from there. And if you will unmute yourself, please.
Thank you for all your comments. So listening to John, what immediately sprang to mind, of course, is the plasticity of the mind. But it made me think. You talked about sleeping, and it made me think, well, maybe that's how I unlearned, or to get rid of that. I went to Japan to sleep. I went to sleep in Japan. What a recipe. But yes, I also realized it's very much connected with the body-mind split, which is a particular Western problem for historical reasons. And I think the reason why it disappeared is when I started getting reconnected with my body, which happened naturally in that environment, because the environment was right. It's much more difficult in our environment here, because the environment is not necessarily conducive to that. Everything we learn and is changing, but it's still very much geared on sort of the body and the mind split. And when you think of organizations, there's the leaders and the bodies. The leaders do the thinking, and the bodies do the other workers doing the work, and it's still very much predicated on that, which is not what I found in Japan, which is totally different. But I didn't really learn it in terms of following a program. It just sort of being there, made it natural. And the anxiety of not knowing, that's so, yes, it's so difficult, and yet it's so important. And Laureen, so you mentioned the variety of perspectives. I do think it's important that we maintain the different and the possibility of having, because that's exactly what we need in our is this ability to have different perspectives. And I mean, that's what multi-mind ultimately is about. And so we don't want to unlearn too much. And indeed, there are many skills that we don't really want to learn. I mean, the languages we speak, for example, coming back to languages, even the ones I don't speak, you do become rusty, but you don't unlearn them completely. And when you go back into that mode, it all comes back. And yes, but the vulnerability of letting go is not an easy one. It's easily said, but much more difficult to actually do. So maybe maybe what we need to find practices that enable us to practice that. I mean, the one I've mentioned before elsewhere is the way that Toyota did it. They just told all their managers that the automatic response is always to respond to any question that comes to us with "I don't know," and any other answer is a taboo. And the point is, it's not about not knowing or knowing. Maybe even if they know, they have to answer "I don't know." But it's the moment even if you know as an expert, you may be an expert. Even if you do know, if you say you don't know, you suddenly open up the possibilities, because suddenly you have what you do know, but you have all kinds of other knowledge which are also part of the equation. And so it totally changes and shifts the perspective. Okay, enough said. Thank you for your audience. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, François. And thanks everyone for joining us for this episode of Purple Octopus. Until next time.